She was never the kind of person people noticed when she walked into a room. There was nothing flashy about the way she dressed, nothing loud about the way she spoke. She carried herself with quietness, and because of that, most assumed she was ordinary. Some even thought she was less than ordinary. She lived a simple life, wore simple clothes, and came to the math class without trying to prove anything to anyone. She was there because she loved numbers, even if she was not always quick with them. For her, math was like a puzzle, and she enjoyed puzzles the way a child enjoys putting together broken pieces until a picture appears. The other students in the class were different. Many of them came with sharp confidence, carrying heavy books, speaking loudly, and showing off how much they already knew. They seemed to come not just to learn but also to compete with each other, and sometimes, to compete with the teacher. Their words filled the room, their laughter carried across the hall, and their boldness often silenced others who were not as outspoken. In the middle of all this noise, she quietly found her seat near the back corner of the classroom, opening her notebook carefully, waiting for the lesson to begin. From the very first day, she knew she was different from the rest of them. When the teacher asked questions, the others raised their hands quickly, shouting answers, even before the teacher finished speaking. She, on the other hand, waited. She listened. She thought carefully. And when she finally gave an answer, it was usually in a soft voice that the others barely heard. Sometimes she was right, sometimes she was wrong, but what stood out most to the others was not her answer, it was her hesitation. In a room full of bold students, her carefulness looked like weakness, and they quickly began to judge her for it. At first, the mockery was small. A few giggles when she mispronounced a term. A smirk when she stumbled through her explanation of a formula. But over time, it grew bolder. When she asked questions, some students whispered to each other, shaking their heads as if her questions were foolish. They called her the simple woman, not always loudly, but enough that she could hear. The nickname spread quickly. To them, it was harmless fun. To her, it was a quiet weight pressing down, making her feel smaller each day. Still, she never answered their mockery with anger. Instead, she looked back at her notebook, wrote her notes carefully, and carried on as though she hadn't heard. The teacher, too, noticed the difference. While the teacher never mocked her directly, there were moments when impatience showed. When she raised her hand, the teacher sometimes sighed, already expecting a slow or confused question. "Yes, what is it this time?" the teacher would say, half smiling but not kindly. The class would chuckle softly, and she would feel her face warm with embarrassment. Yet even in those moments, she refused to put her hand down. She believed that if she didn't understand something, it was better to ask than to remain silent in ignorance. That courage, though unseen by most, was her quiet strength. Outside of class, her life was no different. She came from a modest home, with no history of great education or brilliance in her family. She had not attended fancy schools, nor did she have access to expensive tutors. Everything she learned the hard way by persistence. While others read advanced books in their free time, she sat at her kitchen table late into the night, going over the day's lessons again and again. Sometimes she solved problems by writing them out 5, 10, even 15 times, until the steps made sense in her mind. She was not fast, but she was consistent. She was not flashy, but she was determined. And determination, though invisible at first, is stronger than brilliance that burns out too quickly. The classroom, however, rarely saw her hard work. What they saw was her hesitation, her quietness, and her simplicity. And so the judgments continued. When she solved a problem correctly, no one clapped or admired her. When she got something wrong, the whispers began again. There were moments when she thought of leaving the class altogether. After all, who would notice if she disappeared? The others would carry on, laughing, competing, boasting about their intelligence. No one would miss the simple woman in the corner. But every time the thought of leaving came to her, she reminded herself why she had joined in the first place. She loved numbers. She loved the challenge. She was not there to prove herself to them, she was there to prove something to herself. And that reminder kept her coming back, day after day. It was not easy. She carried their mockery home with her, sometimes sitting alone in her small room, replaying the laughter in her head. She wondered why people enjoyed belittling others. She wondered if they even realized how much it hurt. But instead of letting the pain turn to bitterness, she used it as fuel. If they believed she was simple, then she would quietly surprise them one day. She did not know when or how, but she trusted that her hard work would pay off. She trusted that numbers, unlike people, never lied. A problem, once solved, could not be mocked away. And that thought gave her peace. Her routine remained the same. Every morning she arrived early, sitting in the same chair at the back. She kept her eyes on the board, her pen moving carefully across the pages of her notebook. She ignored the loud conversations around her, the laughter, the remarks. She was patient. She was focused. And though the others did not see it, within her mind, she was slowly building a quiet strength, one that would not need to shout or boast, but one that would one day speak louder than all their laughter combined. On that ordinary day, as she entered the class and sat in her usual place, the others once again overlooked her presence. They laughed, joked, and prepared for another session of difficult mathematics. No one expected much from her, as always. But what none of them knew was that life has a way of turning the tables when least expected. The simple woman they mocked was not weak. She was steady, patient, and quietly prepared for a moment that would surprise them all. That moment was coming soon, though none of them could see it yet. The days passed, and the math class grew more difficult. What started with simple formulas and easy equations now turned into longer, more complex problems that stretched across the board. The teacher's chalk moved quickly, filling the space with strange symbols and lengthy steps. Some students felt excited, eager to show off their knowledge. Others struggled but hid their weakness behind loud jokes and careless laughter. And in the middle of all this, the simple woman sat quietly, her pen moving slowly, her eyes following each mark on the board with care. She asked questions whenever something was unclear. Her questions were not clever or polished like those of her classmates. They were plain and direct. Why is this number moved here, or why do we divide at this step? Some students rolled their eyes, whispering that she was slowing down the lesson. A few even chuckled openly, nudging each other when she raised her hand again. To them, her questions seemed childish, as if she was always a step behind. They did not realize that by asking those simple questions, she was building a stronger foundation than all of them combined. She wanted to understand every piece of the puzzle, not just pretend to know. The whispers turned sharper as the lessons advanced. During breaks, she sometimes overheard them talking. "She doesn't belong here," one boy said, loud enough for her to catch his words. "She should be in a beginner's class." Another girl laughed and added, "Maybe she just wants to look smart but doesn't know how." Their voices carried easily in the small room, and though she pretended not to hear, her heart absorbed every word. Still, she refused to let their opinions chase her away. She believed that patience was her weapon. She reminded herself that numbers did not care about pride. Numbers cared only about truth. The teacher also grew more demanding. Each day, the problems became trickier, and the pressure in the room rose. Students began to compare themselves to each other, measuring their speed and accuracy. Those who solved problems quickly were admired. Those who struggled became targets of ridicule. Naturally, she fell into the second group in their eyes. She was not fast. She took her time, writing each step with neatness, double-checking her answers. And though she often reached the correct solution, her slowness gave the others another reason to laugh. "By the time she finishes, the class will be over," someone joked once, and the entire row burst into laughter. She looked down at her notebook, pretending to be busy, while her ears burned. At night, in the silence of her home, she remembered those moments. She did not cry, though sometimes she wanted to. Instead, she worked harder. She spread her notes across the table, solving the same problems again and again until her hand grew tired. If the class gave her 20 problems, she tried to do 40. If she made mistakes, she corrected them until the steps became natural. She knew she was not the fastest, but she promised herself she would never stop learning. She told herself that laughter could not erase knowledge, and every line she wrote brought her closer to proving it. Her family, though not highly educated, supported her quietly. They saw her sitting at the table for long hours, her head bent over the notebook, and they admired her persistence. "You are working harder than anyone," her brother once told her. She smiled gently but said nothing. For her, it was not about comparison. It was about commitment. She wanted to honor her love for learning, no matter how others treated her. Back in the classroom, the gap between her and the others seemed to widen. Some students flaunted their quick answers, scribbling solutions in seconds and raising their hands proudly. They thrived on competition, seeking attention and applause. The teacher praised them often, and their confidence grew. Meanwhile, she remained the quiet shadow, always working, always asking, always doubted. Yet she never let bitterness creep in. She believed that storms pass, and patience brings light. One particular day, the teacher announced that the next session would include a challenge. "We will attempt problems that many consider too difficult for this level," he said, a spark of excitement in his eyes. The class buzzed with energy. Some whispered eagerly about showing off their skills. Others worried but tried not to show it. She listened silently, her heart steady. She knew that difficult problems meant more work for her, but she also felt a small thrill. She liked challenges, even if no one expected her to succeed. That evening, she prepared herself. She reviewed old problems, looked at examples, and tested herself with harder questions than usual. The mistakes were many, but so were the corrections. She stayed awake long after the house went quiet, her candle burning low, her notebook filled with crossed-out numbers and rewritten steps. When she finally closed her book, her hand was tired, her eyes heavy, but her heart calm. She felt ready, even if no one else believed in her. The day of the challenge arrived. The classroom felt different, filled with nervous energy. The teacher carried a stack of problems, each one more difficult than the last. He wrote the first problem on the board, and the students leaned forward eagerly. Some rushed to answer, while others hesitated. Mistakes were made, laughter filled the air, and the teacher shook his head in both amusement and disappointment. Through it all, she sat quietly, studying the problem with her steady gaze. She was not the first to speak, but she was not afraid to try. When her turn came, a murmur spread through the class. "She'll take forever," someone whispered. "Let's see how many mistakes she makes this time," another added. The words reached her ears, but she did not let them disturb her. She picked up her chalk, her hands steady, and walked slowly to the board. Her steps were calm, though her heart beat faster than usual. Standing before the board, she began to write. Her movements were not quick, but they were precise. Step by step, she laid out her reasoning, explaining in her soft voice why she moved each number, why she divided, why she added. For a moment, the room fell into an unusual silence. Her patience was visible in every line she drew. When she reached the answer, the teacher paused, checking carefully. Then he nodded. "Correct," he said, a hint of surprise in his tone. The class shifted uncomfortably. Some students laughed nervously, others rolled their eyes, but no one could deny that she had done it. For once, her work could not be mocked away. The truth stood on the board, clear and undeniable. That moment was small, but it planted a seed. Though the laughter did not end completely, the whispers grew weaker. Some students avoided making fun of her directly, realizing she was not as helpless as they thought. Still, the doubts remained. They believed her success was luck, a rare chance. They did not know she had built it with long nights and endless practice. But she knew. And that was enough. She returned to her seat quietly, her expression calm, her heart carrying a quiet strength. She had faced their laughter, their whispers, their doubt, and still she stood. She knew the road ahead would bring even greater challenges, and she knew the mocking would not disappear overnight. But she was ready. She had learned that their voices could not define her. Only her work, her patience, and her love for learning could. And as she looked at the board that day, she felt something stir inside her, a quiet certainty that the day would come when even the loudest voices in that room would fall silent, not with laughter, but with awe. The weeks moved forward, and the lessons in the classroom grew heavier. The numbers stretched longer, the formulas became sharper, and the board filled with symbols that looked like a foreign language to some. Students who once laughed loudly now began to feel the weight of the subject. Some grew restless, some grew quiet, and some turned their frustration into more jokes. But the simple woman remained the same. She still came early, sat in her corner, and filled her notebook carefully. While others were anxious about grades, she focused only on understanding, one line at a time. One morning, the teacher walked into the classroom with a different kind of energy. His eyes carried excitement, and his hands held a paper folded neatly. He placed it on the table and looked around the room with a smile that made everyone lean forward. "Today," he said, "we are going to try something unusual." The room buzzed instantly. The students loved unusual days, because it meant competition, challenge, and a chance to shine. "This," the teacher continued, lifting the paper, "is a problem that has defeated many students in the past. Some even call it impossible." The word hung in the air like thunder. Impossible. The students exchanged quick glances, their eyes wide with thrill and fear. The teacher walked to the board and began to write. Slowly, carefully, he filled the space with a long equation. Numbers stretched across one line and continued to another, tangled with signs and fractions that seemed endless. It was the kind of problem that drained confidence before a pencil even touched the paper. As the chalk tapped against the board, the class fell into silence, every eye fixed on the growing puzzle. By the time the teacher stepped aside, the board was heavy with lines, and the impossible problem stood before them like a mountain. For a moment, no one moved. Then the whispers began. "This is insane. Nobody can solve that. Why would he even bring this to us?" Some laughed nervously, while others leaned forward in challenge, already planning their attack. A group of boys near the front began scribbling quickly, racing against each other, determined to be the first. A girl near the window bit her lip, her pen trembling above her notebook. Across the room, shoulders stiffened, brows furrowed, and the sound of scratching pens filled the air. She, however, sat still. Her notebook lay open, her pen ready, but she did not rush. She read the problem slowly, her eyes moving line by line, as though listening to a quiet story hidden inside the numbers. To her, math was not about speed. It was about rhythm. She looked for patterns, for connections, for the small opening that would allow her to step inside the tangled forest. While the others fought wildly with the equations, she breathed slowly and allowed the problem to settle in her mind. The mocking voices returned quickly. One boy glanced back at her corner, smirking. "Don't bother, this is beyond you," he whispered loudly enough for his friends to hear. They laughed, shaking their heads. Another student added, "If she tries, we'll be here till midnight." The laughter echoed again, bouncing off the walls. The teacher didn't stop them, he was too focused on watching the chaos unfold as students struggled with the problem. She heard every word, but she kept her eyes on the board, refusing to let their voices break her focus. Minutes stretched on. Papers rustled. Frustration grew louder. Students erased, rewrote, cursed under their breath. The problem refused to open its doors to them. Some gave up and leaned back, shaking their heads in defeat. Impossible, one muttered. Another slammed his pen down, his pride bruised. Yet through all of this noise, she continued to watch. Something in the equation began to glow in her mind. It was faint at first, like a flicker of light in a dark cave, but it grew clearer the longer she stared. A small pattern, a hidden step, a line that others overlooked, it called to her. Her heart beat faster, but her face remained calm. She knew this feeling. It was the quiet moment before everything made sense. She lowered her pen to the page. Unlike the others, she did not scribble. She wrote a single step. Then another. Her hand moved quickly now, tracing the path her mind had uncovered. It was simple, so simple that she almost laughed. What seemed impossible at first revealed itself as a puzzle with one hidden key. And she had found it. Her pen flew across the page, and in just 17 seconds, the solution was written clearly before her eyes. She stared at it for a moment, hardly believing it herself. Then she lifted her head and looked at the board. The room was still filled with noise, but inside her, there was silence. A calm certainty filled her chest. She raised her hand slowly, her voice soft but steady. I have the answer. The words cut through the chaos, and the room froze. For a moment, no one reacted. Then the laughter returned, sharper this time. Her? Impossible, someone said. No way, another added. The teacher raised his brows, surprised, but he nodded toward her. Come, he said simply. She stood, holding her notebook close. Her steps were steady, though the stares of the entire room pressed against her. She reached the board, took the chalk, and began to write. The first line appeared, clean and precise. Then the second. Then the third. Her soft voice explained each step, the logic flowing like water, smooth and clear. The class watched, their smirks fading slowly. Some leaned forward, confused by how simple it looked when she wrote it. Others frowned, realizing she had taken a path none of them had even considered. By the time she reached the last line and circled the answer, the room was silent. The teacher stepped closer, his eyes scanning the board. He traced her steps carefully, checking each line, each symbol. Then he looked at her, his face filled with something the class had never seen before: respect. Correct, he said firmly. The single word rang out in the quiet room like a bell. For a moment, no one moved. Then the silence broke into gasps and murmurs. The students looked at her in disbelief. The same voices that mocked her, the same eyes that overlooked her, now stared at her with shock. In 17 seconds, she had done what they could not do in 20 minutes. She placed the chalk down and walked back to her seat without a smile, without pride. Her heart was steady. She did not need their applause. She did not need their approval. The answer was on the board, clear and undeniable. That was enough. She sat down, opened her notebook again, and quietly waited for the next lesson, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But the classroom was not the same anymore. The air had shifted. For the first time, they saw her not as a simple woman to be mocked, but as someone who carried a quiet strength none of them had understood. The impossible problem had been solved. And it was not solved by the loudest voice, nor the quickest hand, nor the proudest student. It was solved by the one they laughed at. The one they ignored. The one they called simple. And though the laughter had filled the room before, now it was silence that ruled. Silence and respect. After that unforgettable day when she solved the impossible problem in only 17 seconds, the classroom atmosphere changed. The silence that followed her solution had left a mark. Students who once laughed openly at her now kept their voices lower. Their whispers were softer, their smirks uncertain. Some avoided her gaze altogether, as if ashamed of their earlier words. Yet others, though quiet on the outside, struggled inside with disbelief. They could not accept that the woman they had mocked so often had solved a challenge none of them could handle. Some excused it as luck, others said it was a fluke, but deep down, every one of them knew they had witnessed something rare and undeniable. She, however, did not let the attention disturb her. The next morning, she returned to class as usual, carrying her plain notebook, sitting in her usual seat near the back. She did not walk in with pride, nor did she expect applause. She acted as though nothing had changed, though everything had. The others watched her quietly now. Their laughter did not follow her anymore. Instead, there was a kind of caution in their eyes, as though they were looking at someone they did not fully understand. For her, that was enough. Respect was not given with words, it was felt in silence. The teacher, too, looked at her differently. Where once there had been impatience in his tone when she asked questions, now there was attention. He began to listen more carefully, to explain more thoughtfully. Sometimes, when she answered, his nod carried more weight than before. It was as if solving that problem had not only proven her intelligence to the class, but also to him. Yet she never acted proud. She continued asking her simple questions, writing her slow and steady notes, and working tirelessly at home. To her, the 17-second miracle was not an end but only a step forward. Still, the memory of that moment stayed fresh in everyone's mind, and with it came new challenges. Some students grew curious, watching her more closely, trying to see how she thought, how she solved problems. They whispered less but observed more. Others, however, carried jealousy in their hearts. They could not accept that she, the woman they had ridiculed, had succeeded where they had failed. Their pride was bruised, and pride can be a dangerous thing. A few tried to work harder, determined to prove they were still better. They pushed themselves, competed even more fiercely, and sometimes spoke with sharper voices, as if to remind everyone else of their superiority. But no matter how hard they tried, they could not erase the memory of her calm solution. For her, life outside the class remained the same. She still lived simply, still studied at her small table by candlelight, still spent hours rewriting equations until they made perfect sense. But now there was a quiet fire within her. That day had shown her that patience and persistence could overcome mockery. She had felt the weight of their doubt, and she had lifted it with her own hands. The taste of that victory was not prideful, but it was sweet. It gave her strength to continue, to trust herself even more deeply. She no longer carried their words like chains. Instead, she carried her determination like armor. The next few weeks brought new lessons, each one more complex than the last. The teacher, perhaps inspired by her unexpected success, began to bring more challenging problems to class. Some students groaned, some felt nervous, and some grew excited. But she faced them all with the same calmness. She did not always solve them quickly, but she approached each one carefully, piece by piece. And sometimes, when others were stuck, she saw the small details they missed. Slowly, her classmates began to realize that her strength was not speed or showmanship, it was clarity. She looked at problems differently, and that difference made her strong. There were still moments of resistance. Some students could not let go of their pride. They whispered that her success had been luck, that she could not do it again. Yet deep down, their confidence had cracked. When the teacher wrote new problems on the board, they no longer laughed at her immediately. They glanced at her, almost nervously, wondering if she would once again do what they could not. Even those who disliked her could not help but watch her more closely. She had become, in their eyes, a quiet mystery. The teacher, too, began giving her more opportunities. He sometimes asked her to explain her steps to the class, and though her voice was soft, the room grew still when she spoke. At first, she was nervous. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the chalk, her voice barely above a whisper. But as she explained her reasoning, she grew steadier. The silence of her classmates gave her courage. She realized that when she stood at the board, it was not about proving herself to them. It was about honoring her own love for learning, the same love that had carried her through their laughter. And so, each time she stood before the class, she grew a little stronger. Her respect in the classroom grew quietly, like a tree pushing roots into the earth. No one announced it, no one admitted it openly, but it was there. When she walked to the board, the laughter was gone. When she asked questions, the whispers were fewer. When she solved problems, the silence was deeper. And though some still clung to jealousy, even they could not erase what she had done. The 17 seconds had become a story in itself, told again and again, each retelling leaving her classmates more amazed. Yet for her, the journey was not about that one moment. She knew that one victory did not define a person. What mattered was consistency, patience, and persistence. She continued working harder than anyone, quietly, without need for recognition. She knew that in life, respect was not earned in a single instant but built through many small acts of perseverance. And so, while the others battled with pride and competition, she walked her steady path, step by step. The classroom had been her battlefield, the chalk her weapon, and the notebook her shield. She had faced mockery, doubt, and isolation. But now, she faced respect, curiosity, and even envy. It was a different challenge, but she carried herself the same way she always had: calm, humble, and determined. She did not let the weight of their eyes change her. She remembered the days when their laughter rang in her ears, and she remembered how she had endured it silently. If she could survive mockery, she could survive admiration as well. Neither praise nor ridicule could change her heart. Her love for learning was stronger than both. And so, the simple woman they once laughed at became the quiet figure they could not ignore. Every problem she solved, every step she explained, was a reminder of the day she turned silence into respect. Though the 17 seconds had passed, its echo remained, shaping the way they saw her and the way she saw herself. The memory of the 17 seconds never left the classroom. Weeks passed, and though the students returned to their usual routines, there was always a trace of that day in the air. Whenever the teacher wrote a difficult problem on the board, a few eyes would turn toward her, half expecting her to see something they could not. Some still carried pride, unwilling to admit her brilliance openly, but even they could not laugh the way they once did. Their laughter had been replaced by a quiet respect, one born from something they had witnessed with their own eyes and could not deny. For her, life continued in the same steady rhythm. She still came early, carrying her simple notebook, and still sat in the corner seat. She still worked late at night at her small table, reviewing problems, solving them again and again until they became clear. She never thought of herself as special, never carried herself with arrogance. She remained the same humble woman she had always been, but inside, something had changed. She carried a stronger confidence now, not the loud kind that needed to be seen, but the quiet kind that grew from endurance. She had faced their doubts, she had survived their laughter, and she had proven to herself that she was capable of more than even she had believed. The teacher noticed this change as well. His lessons grew more challenging, and often, he called on her to solve problems or explain them to the class. Each time she stood at the board, her heart still beat quickly, but she no longer trembled. Her voice, though soft, carried steadiness. She explained each step with patience, not to impress anyone, but because she wanted others to see the path clearly. Many students who once mocked her began to listen carefully, realizing that her explanations often revealed the simplest way to solve even the hardest problems. Some even began to ask her questions after class, quietly seeking her help. She never turned anyone away. She shared her knowledge freely, never reminding them of their past mockery. For her, teaching was another way of learning, and kindness was stronger than pride. The day came when the teacher announced the final challenge of the term. He said it would be the hardest problem yet, something designed to test not only knowledge but also patience and creativity. The class grew restless, nervous whispers filling the air. They remembered the last time they had been given something called impossible, and they could not help glancing at her again. She felt their eyes but kept her calm. She did not see the problem as a competition. To her, it was simply another puzzle waiting to be solved. When the teacher wrote the problem on the board, the students leaned forward with pens ready. The lines stretched long, tangled with fractions and unknowns, complex enough to intimidate even the best. Many students attacked it fiercely, scribbling with determination. Erasers rubbed quickly, frustration grew, and the classroom filled with restless energy. She, however, took her time. She studied the board quietly, letting her eyes rest on each line, waiting for the problem to speak to her. She had learned that numbers always had a rhythm, and if she listened long enough, the rhythm would reveal itself. Minutes passed, and frustration spread across the room. Some students gave up, shaking their heads. Others grew louder, muttering about how unfair it was. But she remained steady, her pen moving calmly across the page. Soon, she saw at the opening, the pattern others had missed. Her lips curved into a faint smile. With careful steps, she began writing her solution, each line flowing smoothly from the one before. When she reached the final step, her answer shone clearly on the page. Once again, she had found clarity where others saw chaos. This time, when she raised her hand, the room did not laugh. Instead, silence fell instantly. Every pair of eyes turned to her, some with hope, some with doubt, but all with curiosity. She walked to the board, her steps unhurried, and began to write. The chalk moved steadily in her hand, the answer unfolding before them. As she explained in her quiet voice, the class listened closely, the way they once had not. When she circled the final answer, the teacher's eyes gleamed with pride. He nodded and said firmly, "Correct again." The silence that followed was not mocking, it was filled with awe. For the first time, some students clapped. It began slowly, a few hands at first, then more joined in until the sound filled the room. She stood at the board, surprised by the sound, but she did not smile with pride. Instead, she bowed her head slightly and returned to her seat. To her, applause was not the goal. The goal was learning, and she had achieved it. Still, the sound of their hands echoed in her heart, not as a celebration of victory, but as proof that patience and humility could change even the hardest hearts. From that day on, the way they treated her was different. No one called her the simple woman anymore. No one mocked her questions or doubted her presence in the classroom. She had earned their respect, not by shouting, not by competing, but by staying true to herself. She showed them that strength is not always loud, and brilliance is not always dressed in pride. Sometimes, the quietest person in the room carries the greatest light. Her story spread beyond the classroom. Other teachers heard about the woman who solved the impossible problem in 17 seconds. Some came to see her during lessons, curious about her. She never enjoyed the attention, but she accepted it with grace. She continued her studies with the same dedication, always focusing on progress, never on fame. Her life outside the classroom remained unchanged, still simple, still humble, but now she carried with her a story that inspired many. Friends and neighbors who once thought of her as ordinary began to see her differently. They realized that greatness does not always shout from the stage. Sometimes it whispers from the back corner of a classroom. In the end, the simple woman who was mocked became a symbol of perseverance. She showed her classmates, her teacher, and even herself that true power lies in patience, in persistence, and in the courage to keep going despite doubt. She did not win through pride, nor through competition, but through humility and determination. And though the world outside might forget many things, those who sat in that classroom would never forget the day she solved the impossible in 17 seconds. It was a reminder that no one should ever be underestimated, and that even the quietest voices can carry answers that shake the room into silence. She carried on with her journey, never boasting, never demanding recognition. She continued to live simply, continued to love numbers, and continued to walk her quiet path. But the respect she had earned remained with her, not as a trophy, but as a gentle flame that burned in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed her strength. And whenever anyone doubted themselves, they remembered her story, the story of the woman who was once mocked, but who rose above it all with patience, courage, and a brilliance that spoke louder than words.